Maybe it's an occupational hazard of being a pastor, but when I find myself with a little bit of free time, I find myself often drawing pictures or making sketches or painting pictures of Jesus. And they're all different. I find that over the years, I find sometimes I'll make something that could be realistic. Sometimes they're cast in a modern situation. Sometimes they have that sort of symbolic look of old classic Orthodox icons. Sometimes they are quickly sketched out late in the middle of the night with colored pencils and look like they're thrown together. And none of them look the same. And I think that's intentional, not on my part so much as it is on Jesus' part. It's interesting to me as I think about it that we don't get anywhere in the Bible any really clear description of what Jesus looked like, as if to say you could spot him in a crowd. If anything, the scriptures give us this impression that when the Messiah came, people would not even notice him because he looked just like anybody else. Didn't walk 6 inches above the ground, didn't have the golden halo, didn't command angel armies. But the whole notion of Jesus coming among us, of God's Messiah coming among us, is that God shares our ordinary humanity. And in fact, when Jesus gets around to describing, even in a scene of great glory and power, about how we'll recognize him, he doesn't start describing facial features or his height. He doesn't say, look for the guy who's 6'3" and wearing sandals. Instead, Jesus points us in surprising directions of those who are most vulnerable and in need. There's this fantastic and surprising and powerful story that we hear this coming Sunday. And it's this fantastic surprise. On this coming Sunday, the church celebrates the reign of Christ, what's sometimes called Christ the King Sunday. And it's meant to be this day that celebrates that future triumph when Christ's reign fills all things, when God's kingdom comes in its fullness, where every knee bows and every tongue confesses that Jesus is Lord. And so you expect to be, this is the most glorious, triumphant sort of moment in the year. Jesus is going to show us his presence and power and might and pomp. And the story Jesus gives us, the story we are told on this coming Sunday this year, sets us up expecting that. Jesus tells a story about one day when the king will sit on his throne. He'll judge between the nations, like a shepherd separates sheep from goats. And then he goes on to describe what makes the difference in that final judgment scene. And in the end, Jesus says things that are meant to surprise us about where we recognize him. You probably know the words, but they're worth hearing again. Jesus says, I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was naked and you gave me clothing. I was a prisoner and you visited me. I was sick and you took care of me. I was a foreigner, a stranger, and you welcomed me. And of course, the people who hear Jesus offer all this praise. They, Jesus, when did this happen? When did we do any of those things for you? We didn't recognize you. And Jesus' response comes, when you did it for even the least of these, my brothers and sisters, you did it for me. Jesus doesn't give us a description of what historical Jesus of Nazareth looked like. We don't get a description of how full his beard was, what color his robe was, what size his sandals were. None of that, despite the fact that we keep making paintings and making pictures and assuming we know what Jesus would look like. Instead, what Jesus gives us is, look for me in the faces of those who are most vulnerable. Look for me in the presence of those who are on the margins. Look for me among those who get pushed aside and told they don't matter. If you want to get a glimpse of where Jesus is, look at those places. And amazingly, wonderfully too, in that story Jesus gives us, that one day at the great judgment of all the nations, this will be the conversation. Even the people who have done all these wonderful things, who've fed the hungry and taken care of the naked and the sick and the imprisoned and the foreigner, even all those people are blessedly clueless. They are completely surprised when Jesus says, that was me all along. That's the thing I love about this story too. Lest we turn this into a matter of do these good things and then God will love you. The people in Jesus' story who are feeding the hungry and welcoming the stranger, the people who are offering clothing to those who are in need or welcome for those who are outsiders, They don't do it because they realize they're going to get brownie points for it. They're just as surprised, as baffled at the end of the story to realize it was Jesus all along. Maybe Jesus hasn't given us the story so that we can spot Jesus in a crowd and go, oh, that hungry person must be Jesus, I'll be nice to them. Oh, that homeless person must be Jesus, I'll be nice to them. But to say, everywhere, among all those who are vulnerable, all those who are on the margins, all those who suffer, God chooses to identify with them. And if you want to be a part of the movement of what Jesus is about, it's about recognizing Jesus not just in the portraits with the halo or the power and the gold paint, but it's about recognizing Jesus in our most need and broken humanity, about in all of our ordinariness and messiness, our most desperate need, and in one another on the margins. That's going to change how we look for Jesus in the world these days. It's going to change what we do in the world as well. What would happen? What would happen if you and I stepped out of our front door every morning thinking, I'm going to encounter people in whom Jesus chooses to be present? How will you treat everybody you cross paths with? And maybe we'll discover Jesus has set things up so we get to be both the face of Christ for somebody else and to see the face of Christ in somebody else. That Christ can be in all those places all the time at every side of the interaction. That's part of Jesus in his divine genius. Not just showing up in one spot in the crowd, but in those we care for, and that we get to be the chance to be the face of Christ for somebody else who is looking, aching, waiting to hear that God's love is for them too. It's a totally different way of seeing the world. And instead of saying we got to find what the one right portrait of Jesus is, it's about being willing to be surprised when we see Jesus everywhere all around us. That's the conversation we're having this Sunday for Christ the King Sunday. Join us then. See you Sunday.